Why are we drawn here? The reasons are as individual as ourselves. Some of us are drawn to the beauty, majestic, yet simple. Some of us romanticize about the keepers who once lived their dedicated lives here. And still others marvel over a level of craftsmanship that has allowed these buildings to stand for over 2 centuries. Whatever the reasons, one thing holds true. We all see the important role lighthouses have played in shaping our country's history, both in the past, as premier navigational aids for our growing country, making our harbors and coastlines safe, and the present, as symbols of a long-ago era we wish to preserve. Come along with us as we investigate our fascination with these mesmerizing towers of history. Watch as lighthouses evolve from simple mechanical structures to state-of-the-art machines backed by the latest technology. And then, witness how this same technology eliminates the need for lighthouses as aids to navigation. We'll meet some of the people responsible for lighthouses, those that built them, those that kept them, and those that are bringing them back to life today. We'll investigate what lies ahead for these maritime icons. Will they crumble into dust? Or will they live on and continue their role in sending out the light? The need for aids to navigation is as old as sailing itself. Even before lighthouses, sailing ships needed to safely mark their way in and out of harbors and channels.
As mankind started to take more and more bold steps, navigating further offshore, in between city-states or between cities or between countries, the speed of the vessel was often dictated that it would require a couple of days for the navigator or the mariner to reach another port, which meant if he didn't put into a shore each night, that he had to sail at night. And early navigators depended on very crude bonfires, which were established at the entrances or near major ports, shipping ports. So the first lighthouses, if you will, were open fires.
However, the setting of open fires wasn't always the safest method. That is, when you didn't know who was setting your light.
Back in the 1700s, they would light fires on the islands to mark the channel. Like there would be a fire on this island, and the mariners would know that this is the channel, and they would keep to the right or keep to the left of this fire. Well, spoilers would come out. They would row out here at night, put this fire out, go out one other island over to Great Brewster and set a fire on that island. That way, the mariners would think this was all water, and that late at night, back then there was no loom from city lights or anything, you couldn't see a thing, and they would wreck right out here. And they would be sitting out there watching them, waiting for them to wreck, and then they would come out and they would take anything of any value that they could find.
Wrecking, or pirating, became a serious problem for sailors and merchants alike. As a practice, it survived only because of the unorganized and primitive methods used to make our channel safe. As more permanent lights were used, wrecking all but disappeared.
Because of the wrecking business, Key West became the wealthiest city in America per capita. And then by 1880, the chain of lighthouses was finished. There is one every 25 miles, the whole length of the Florida Keys. When that one was finished, then people turned to cigar making and sponging and other industries because wrecking was no longer the successful business that it was in the early days.
Technology also helped advance the building of lighthouses and making our harbors safe. Keepers experimented with various oils to be used as fuel to try to burn their lights brighter. But when kerosene was discovered, keepers realized they were onto something. When they took this earth oil and mixed it with air at high pressure, it burned brighter than anything they had seen before. These brighter lights were then projected further out to sea with the next great advancement in technology, the invention of the Fresnel lens. Augustine Fresnel pioneered this artistic system of cut glass pieced together so that most of the light could be directed through a single piece. These lenses could now magnify a single light source enough to double the distance it could be viewed from sea.
They went from a first order, which is the largest, some of which were 14 feet in height, down to ours, which is about 9.5 feet in height. Then they went to second order, third order, which was primarily used for harbor and river light, and fourth order, which were also used for harbor and river lights. So they decreased, diminished in size. They are made up of individual prisms of glass that were molded in the 1870s. Each prism is different on the larger lights. In essence, you needed several different molds in order to achieve the design needs of those prisms. Then they were taken and hand polished down to optic quality and then installed in the prisms.
The Fresnel lens was a major step in using every bit of the lantern's light and projecting it further and clearer. From this, other systems were developed that would help mariners identify which lighthouse they were actually seeing. Some had a fixed light, a steady white light. Others had a flashing white light. Still others combined the two systems to create various other combinations.
In our case, we used a rotating light. And what it was a panel of lens prisms which rotated around the light source. At the time, it was a kerosene lamp, and that light source would produce a beam of light coming through flash panels, as they're called, and provide a distinctive night signature. Our case, it was 3 bullseye panels, which provided a beam of light 9 minutes in sequence. They were 3 minutes apart, 3 beams of light for a total of a 9-minute sequence. That was the St. Augustine night signature.
Using both a fixed light source and a blinking light source were excellent ways for a mariner to figure out where they were. But some lighthouses, in particularly dangerous areas, went one step further.
Well, this lighthouse is unique because it has a white sector. Out here we have the Brandeis ledges and the seal rocks all along this shore here, and out here off of Kimball Head we have the Kimball ledges, which are great if you're a seal because they make nice places to crawl out of the water and sun yourself, but if you're a boat, they're a real navigational hazard. And the white sector in the lens is a pie-shaped wedge of light that emanates from the tower, and as long as a ship comes and sails into the white light, it means you're being directed between the ledges on either side. If you see red, it means that you're off course out of the channel and you're in danger.
With the right fuel and lens, lighthouses were effective resources for captains sailing their ships in and out of various ports of call. Major commercial cities began building lighthouses to protect their harbors. The first was in Boston.
Boston Light was first constructed in 1716, and it was America's first lighthouse. During the evacuation of 1776, when the British left Boston, when they lost the Revolution, they destroyed Boston Light and blew up the whole thing, except for maybe the bottom 6 or 8 feet, and that laid there until 1783. Then Governor John Hancock that year had it put back up. It was erected again in 1783, and it's been burning ever since.
Portland, by the 1780s, was the 6th largest port in the country, and there was a lot of shipping coming in and out of the port. So the local businessmen needed a way to get that shipping, which was their whole livelihood, in and out of the harbor safely. At that time, Maine was part of Massachusetts, and so they had to go to the Massachusetts legislature for money to begin building here. There was no other way to appropriate it. And the legislature, because we were so far away, didn't come up with the money very quickly. And when they did, they only came up with enough money to begin the construction. That was in 1787. By 1789, we still had a building that was half built, a lighthouse structure that was half built. And then, with the formation of the new federal government in '89, things really began to change. And when the federal government took over all of the colonial lighthouses, there were, this was the 12th in the building of it anyway, colonial lighthouses, they decided that Portland Head should be finished.
As our young country was growing more independent, trading grew strong among the colonies and with other countries across the ocean. The need for safe passage for commerce and travel fell on the shoulders of the new government. In 1789, the Ninth Act of Congress was established to set up a United States Lighthouse Service.
The Ninth Act of Congress, signed by George Washington, was the very first Public Works Act in this country. It's considered, therefore, that building lighthouses was the first great work of the American people. It was the first thing that they really endeavored to do as a nation. So, therefore, historically, lighthouses are very, very important to the United States. And the construction of lighthouses in an era in which boating was of primary importance in terms of immigration and in terms of commerce, the construction of lighthouses so that you could see a lighthouse on wherever you looked along the horizon, every 20 miles, you should be able to see a lighthouse was the goal. And that was achieved. And it allowed the United States to become really the safest nation in terms of water passageways in the world.
Lighthouses were fairly sophisticated at this point. They went from open fires on a hill to oil lanterns enclosed in a protective room. They were focused lights suspended in tall towers. And now, many of our busiest ports were well protected. But with all these advancements, lighthouses were still limited to the shoreline. In many cases, the most dangerous waters were still going unprotected. Areas known as shoals, lying often 40 or 50 miles off our rocky coastlines, were still claiming the lives of many sailors. The problem was, how did you get a light to stand guard 50 miles out in the ocean?
In the case of Nantucket Shoals, 50 miles offshore, you have to let people know that there's shoals that can tear ships apart out there. There's places all over the world that are like that. So they came up with light ships, the idea of putting a beacon on a ship. It sounds pretty simple. Nowadays, when we can take a buoy and put an electric beacon on a buoy, it's pretty easy. In those days, when you had to take basically small fishing vessels and put lanterns on them, ships roll in any kind of a seaway, and lanterns don't like to be rolled. They go out. Also, you had to keep a crew on a ship, living on that ship, because usually the ships were in very inaccessible places. So imagine a crew living on a ship months on end, tending this light in rolling seas. It was very tough.
A crew of 16 was needed to work the light ship, and for most of the time, life on the ship was pretty slow. That is, except for those moments of sheer terror when the ship was hit by forceful storm winds or crashing waves. Also, the ship had to function around the clock. The crew would split into 2 shifts. While some would sleep and relax, the others would tend to their duties.
First of all, you need a cook. You need to feed these fellows. You need engineers, because the plant has to keep running. Although the propulsion system isn't running, you're generating electricity for that light. Or in the case of oil lamps, you're doing all of that work. So there's a lot of engineers working. The captain, the navigational officers are still constantly taking sights to make sure they're on station.
Keeping the lightship on station was essential to the function of the lightship service. But anchoring the ship on a shoal made for a very rocky ride. New ships were designed with flatter and wider bottoms to keep things steady.
Mostly you wanted to keep a ship from rolling, because rolling is really tough on a crew, and it's also very tough on whatever lighting device that you have. So they came up with a flat-bottomed boat rather than a normal round-bottomed boat. And they also put bilge keels on them, which in a sense are long fins along where the turn of the bilges are along the sides of the ship, just below the waterline. Also, lightships soon developed high bluff bows, because lightship at anchor would always swing into the seas, and so it's always going to take the seas dead on the bow. So lightships had to have very high bows to protect the deck houses, to protect the crew, protect the gear.
Lightships and lighthouses. The Ninth Act of Congress and the Lighthouse Service had accomplished many goals to guarantee safe passage to the United States. During this process, however, one of the hardest decisions was to figure out what sort of person should operate these significant landmarks. Who was the one to be called keeper? Dedicated individuals were needed for this type of work. Many spent their whole lives in the line of duty, first as assistant keepers, working their way up to head keeper. Some lighthouses were manned by a group of young bachelors, usually the ones on islands out at sea. Other lighthouses were run by whole families where each member played a significant role in the day-to-day operations of the light.
William Bethel had been a keeper at the Northwest Channel. He, like many of the folks in the Florida Keys, transferred in and out from the various reef lights. There are 5 huge towers along the reefs, and then there's a couple lesser towers like the Northwest Channel. And Bethel had worked at Loggerhead, Northwest Channel, and various other towers until he landed what is the poshest job of all, the Key West Lighthouse. When you're working on the reef, you're out there, and then you come in for 10 days and you go out for a month. But when you're in Key West, you're living in wonderful lodgings right in the middle of a city. And so it was perfect for Bethel and his wife Mary and their 3 children. He was the head keeper, she was the assistant keeper, and his son was the other assistant keeper. So the whole family was on the payroll, and the kids, to listen to the grandchildren talk, they had such a wonderful time here, because if you were the grandson of the lighthouse keeper, you were everybody's friend, because everyone came and played and climbed up and down the tower, and you know, it was a great place to work and live. And so the family did quite successfully here. He died during his tenure as the keeper, and she became the head keeper and kept on with the property until the First World War. But it was a very common occurrence for any of the lighthouses anywhere for the women to take over, as it was a family kind of job where your whole family moved with you. Unless you had the reef lights, then it wasn't a family type thing. But nonetheless, that was just the way it happened. And so she did a remarkable job, but you know, it was much easier here rather than one of the island type lighthouses. Here in the city made it much easier.
Family life, that's what it was all about. Men, women, and children living out their lives in all kinds of situations. Sometimes on isolated rocks in the ocean, and sometimes in green tropical cities of the South. No matter where the lighthouse was located, daily life was full of responsibilities for the keeper as well as the entire family.
Most of the lighthouse keepers that we had here at St. Simon's were sons and grandsons of previous lighthouse keepers. It was in the family. And that's the way they were raised. It was the only life they knew. You also had to be very literate to be a lighthouse keeper, because you had to constantly be filing reports. And you were subject to inspection at any notice. Without notice, the inspector would show up on your doorstep. So in addition to keeping the lens room in the lighthouse spotless, the house had to be spotless. The wife was responsible for not having any dirt in the house. All the pots and pans had to be washed. It had to be just as shipshape as the rest of the lighthouse.
The children were responsible for cleaning up the ground. They in fact had a base of coquina spread out over the ground, and the children were not even allowed to play in the yard. But if a leaf were to drop on that white coquina, they were responsible for going out there and picking up those dead leaves for fear that the district superintendent would come in for an inspection and he not find the total light station and well kept.
Though a well-kept station was important, a keeper's main duty was to always keep the light burning.
He would have to go up at dusk, or at least an hour before dusk, and prime the lantern in order to have the oil prepared to light the wick. And once the wick was lit, the smoke from the lamp would smoke up the lens, so you would have to quickly wipe that down. And then of course he had to turn the weights, which the clockwork mechanism which raised the weights or lowered the weights so that the lens could rotate. So he had to stay awake all night long, of course, trimming the wicks so that the soot wouldn't be too bad on the lens. And also at the end of the evening, when dawn came, he would have to clean the lens again, draw the curtains around the lens to protect the fine Fresnel lens, and then of course come downstairs and go to sleep.
They certainly had the technology to make a clockworks which need not be wound but once a week maybe. But they wanted to make sure the keeper was awake. So they wound that weight up, and he had to wind it every sometimes 2.5, sometimes 4 hours. That was just to ensure that he was on the job at least once or twice during the night. Human nature as it is, the keeper wanted to go to sleep, live a regular life like the rest of us. Some of them devised some very ingenious methods of waking themselves up. They would fall asleep under the weight and have a board on their chest, and when the weight hit the board and pressed on their chest, they would wake up and go up and wind the weights. Other keepers would go to bed, and they'd have a mirror positioned in their window so they could roll over in bed and look in the mirror and see if the light was still on.
Even today, in the last manned lighthouse, we see that the duties necessary to keep a light burning have changed very little.
Our day-to-day routine would be, when we get up in the morning, we send the weather reports to NOAA, barometric pressure, wind direction, wind speed, all that. Right before sunset, or right at sunset, we'll take a walk up the tower and pull the curtain down. The curtain is up during the day to protect the lens, or protect the bulb from being burnt out from the refraction of the lens. And turn the motor and the light on, and make sure it's turning, and make sure the fog signal is going if there's fog, or a heavy rain or any kind of low visibility.
The life of the keeper was one of commitment and service for himself and his whole family. It was also a life of great independence, a life close to nature, filled with the simplistic beauty these towers so often represent. That beauty is preserved for us, captured in the stories told of the people that lived out their lives here, in these buildings they called home. And home was unique for each of the keepers, unique in design and unique in construction. But the architecture of each lighthouse was driven by one key element: its immediate surroundings.
Every lighthouse was built differently, not only for the navigational and geographic needs. Such as in New England, you'll note a lot of the lighthouses up there are much shorter. they're built on cliffs, natural elevations. You didn't need a taller tower. In the south, you're going to find a lower elevation, and you're going to have sandy, dangerous waters extending out for a much greater distance. So they needed a taller lighthouse. In Florida, you don't have a brick industry, so all of your building materials had to be shipped in. And in order to bring the materials in from the ships, they created what's called a marine railway from the lighthouse down to the water. And that marine railway was on rails with a cart on it to haul the materials up to the light.
Usually lighthouses are built from local materials whenever possible. Since tabby was a local material, they would go to Fort Frederica, which at that time was abandoned, and they would cut pieces of the fort and bring it here to be used as a foundation for the lighthouse itself. And it's a very concrete-like material, very strong, and so the first lighthouse lasted a long time.
The tower, the base of the tower, as you can see, is cut granite, quarried here nearby. Not on this. This island is basically volcanic with a few granite boulders here and there brought by the glaciers, but it's basically volcanic. So this granite was brought from another island, and the stone sloops would sail right in here, and they would anchor them out on moorings out in the thoroughfare and tie them back against the shore. These were large sailing ships. And they would unload the stone blocks with davits and crane, and they built the base first, and then they could bring the ships right up against the base and build from there on up to brickwork, the metal lantern room on top, and then back to shore, and then they built the keeper's house and the woodshed, the oil house, and the other outbuildings. And they did the whole thing in 1 year. Amazing engineering on an island that had nowhere to land even a boat. But they knew how to do it then. They knew how to do things efficiently.
Amazing engineering built these lighthouses to last forever. But there was one thing the power and prestige of even the toughest lighthouse couldn't withstand: war. The Great Civil War between North and South. Lighthouses weren't immune to the destruction of war, and in fact, they were often the target of it. It was at this time when man discovered the significant role lighthouses could now play in warfare, as well as guarding our coast. As the shorelines of the South were slowly swallowed up by federal blockades and the Great Northern Navy, the men of the Confederacy realized there was no choice but to destroy these structures protecting their shores.
The cotton kingdom of Georgia, of course, was the primary crop during this time, and Georgia was one of the leading cotton states during the southern plantation economy. The lighthouse played a key role for shipping coming into the harbor as Darien began to grow more and more with its importance as a major cotton port. A series of lightkeepers operated the Sapelo Lighthouse from about 1820 up to the time of the Civil War. When the Civil War came, of course, everything kind of stopped. The plantations died, the town of Darien sort of dried up and withered away because no more ships came in. The lighthouse was abandoned by the Confederate Army, and when the Union Navy blockaded the Georgia coast, as they did the entire Atlantic seaboard, the lighthouse was used as an observation tower. The reports out of the logbooks of the Union vessels offshore indicate that Union officers made frequent visits to Sapelo Island to use the lighthouse as an observation tower to watch for Confederate blockade runners trying to get in and out of the harbor nearby. And so this lighthouse served that purpose until the end of the Civil War in 1865.
And the story was similar for other southern lighthouses along the coast, like Tybee Island Light, just outside Savannah.
During the Civil War, the Confederates who were stationed over at Fort Pulaski came over and they blew off the top part of the lighthouse to keep it from being used by the Federal troops. And that was the only time it was ever out of operation since it was built here in 1773. It was out of, I think, for about 6 years, was out of operation. And instead of building a new lighthouse, they built on the base of this lighthouse, which was the first 60 feet of this lighthouse then date back to 1773. So it makes it one of the oldest lighthouses in the United States.
The Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse was first lit in 1860 after several years of delays in construction. The light was darkened during the Civil War by Southern sympathizers who stole part of the turning mechanism, buried it upriver apparently. The parts were then found by Captain Armour, who later became a keeper at the lighthouse. He took the parts to Key West, which was a safe part of Florida at the time throughout the Civil War. Those parts were returned to this light and reinstalled, and the light was relit in 1866 and has been functioning ever since.
The destruction of the Civil War left many of our southern lighthouses in ruins, some of which were never reconstructed. But as the South began to rebuild, lighthouses were revitalized as a new industry began to grow around their newly built towers.
As you started getting into the 1870s following the Civil War, an interesting phenomenon occurred. Because of the Civil War in the South, you had all these Union forces coming down and seeing sights that they had never seen before. They went back to the North and they talked about things like alligators and oranges and Spanish moss and Southern architecture and some of the sights I saw here, and in essence created a tourist industry. So as people started coming to the South as tourists, they started designing lighthouses to accommodate tourists as well.
Tourism and the role lighthouses played in guarding our shores brought them to their peak during the post-Civil War period. But this renaissance lighthouses experienced declined dramatically as our country moved into the 20th century. Changes in technology, such as the invention of electricity, allowed lights to run for longer periods of time. Slowly, the need for a keeper to take care of the light, its tower, and the grounds upon which it sat were no longer necessary. Then came the Depression. The Great Depression left nothing unscarred, not even our major aids to navigation. Now that the federal government was able to effectively light towers without the cost of a keeper, the keepers were removed. And with that came the end of an era.
During the Depression, this lighthouse and 7 others similar to it, light stations on little islands like this, were auctioned off as a cost-saving procedure during the Depression, and it fell into disuse for 50 years. It was privately owned all those 50 years, but essentially it was boarded up and unused.
Now that system is in decline in the 1900s, in the 20th century, and unfortunately many of the lighthouses have become antiquated. The Coast Guard could very easily do the same job by simply building a flagpole and putting a light bulb on top. And in many cases, they've done just that. And of course, it saves the taxpayers money. And for that reason, you know, it's very popular.
Lighthouses certainly paid the price by being replaced by cheaper, more efficient technology. Luckily for us, these structures were built like nothing else. Some of the most beautiful lighthouses filled with the richest history, are mere shells, standing their ground against time.
As you view the exterior of the Cape Florida Lighthouse, you'll notice the top actually looks to be in rather good condition, but the bottom portions of the lighthouse have lost brick, have lost mortar, and we need to completely re-brick and rejoint the lighthouse. That is a continual process that will essentially result in the complete restoration of the exterior brick surface, and also the ironwork at the top needs to be replaced. The lighthouse keeper's residence will be restored. We have many artifacts that we are essentially keeping in climate-controlled storage at this point in time. The lighthouse keeper's residence still has the storm shutters on it, now more or less for keeping curious people out and not just storm events, but the roof of the front porch dropped during Hurricane Andrew, and this part of the island suffered winds by some estimates up to 170 miles an hour, but yet the residents in the lighthouse stood.
Now we stand at the dawn of a new era for these lights. They're being brought back to life through the efforts of people like those we've seen in this program. States, cities, and towns, organizations, friends, and individuals are working to restore a part of our maritime history.
We've done an extensive historic structures report to document exactly what took place here over the course of the light station history. We've gone through keepers' journals, actual logs written in the hand of the keepers that maintained this light from October 15, 1874, right up until 1947. Based on that documentation, we've developed a restoration guideline, which we're following through the services of our architect and engineer, and we will return this light station basically to the way it appeared in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's the game plan, to bring this station back to the way someone would expect to see it in those times. The exterior color code will remain historically correct, as well as continue to serve as an aid to navigation through its distinctive pattern called a day mark. It is charted with a precise color code on the outside. The black and white diagonal stripe you see and the red metal at the top is the St. Augustine Lighthouse day mark. We have to return that to that color code because not only historically is it correct, it is charted on all navigational charts using that day mark. So we will return those colors to the historic color code. We're going on the inside and taking Frank Welsh's analysis and returning all the woodwork and interior coatings to the historic color we would have found in the 1880s, 1890s. Some interesting color patterns: dark charcoal gray, blacks, whites, just various colors they used throughout lighthouses in America. The white was primarily used on walls to reflect the limited light. It would pick up the natural daylight, magnify it, and project it around the cylinder, the inside of the tower. At night it would pick up limited light from a kerosene lantern perhaps and really magnify that light. So all the walls were painted white. The underside of the landings were painted white for the same reason, help reflect the light. The stairs and the landings, a high-use work area, was painted a dark black in order to hide any scuffing or dirt that might appear. So what you're going to have is a very contrasting white wall with black metal throughout the tower. There are 219 stairs leading to the outside. There are 9 platforms. There's an incredible, almost nautilus type of design of staircase inside that lighthouse. And it's an ingenious design which was really state-of-the-art in the 1870s.
Through many restoration efforts on both a large and small scale, lighthouses and their rich histories are being preserved for all of us to enjoy and learn about. There's no one formula for what's going on in lighthouses today. The restoration of our lighthouses is as individual as the lighthouses themselves. A unique example is the Sapelo Island light and what's happening there.
Sapelo Island is one of 22 national estuarine research reserves around the nation. One of the main functions of the research reserve is public education, and we have a great deal of visitation to the island that rides the ferry boat over to the island. We have public tours over here 3 days a week for the general public. The other 3 days a week, we generally have school field trips, special group activities, and that type of thing. We get a large number of school children come to Sapelo Island to visit the research reserve to be involved in our educational processes over here. We have tour guides that drive buses that bring children as well as the general public to visit various aspects and areas of Sapelo Island. The children as well as the adult visitors to the island can partake in a number of activities over here. For example, we have cast netting and beach seining and that type of thing where people can get hands-on experience catching fish, crabs, shrimp, and various other types of shellfish to actually participate and be involved in some of these estuarine processes. Part of what we're doing on Sapelo Island is involved with the cultural history of Sapelo Island, not just the natural history, and so we hope to incorporate the lighthouse as well as other historic structures on the island into our educational programs and interpretation. This area has a very important maritime and navigational legacy about it for the last 150 years or so. A great deal of things have happened here, and we feel that the lighthouse fits right into the context of that. There is a great deal of public interest in this Sapelo Island lighthouse, and so there has been a lot of support to get it reopened, fixed up to where the people can visit it and see it. And when we get that project completed, it will be a part of our regular public tours. So we feel the lighthouse is an important historical asset which ties in nicely with what we're trying to do in the educational process here.
We live here on Isle of Haut at the light station, and we rent rooms for travelers who want to come and stay at the lighthouse station. We provide all the meals and everything, so it's really quite a time-consuming thing we're doing here. We have no freezers. Everything is baked. Everything is made here, and our cook is from the New England Culinary Institute. But you know, it's not really the food that brings people here. That's just sort of an added, unexpected treat that they experience. But what it is, I think it's the absence of electricity. It's the absence of telephones. It's the absence of all the other amenities that are are bragged about and boasted about first class. We don't even have a road. You can't even drive here. You have to come on the mail boat. And it's that stepping back into almost a frontier type of experience that people are yearning for, you know, in our day and age when there are so many problems in the cities and technology dominates people's lives to such an incredible degree, and to be able to come and not even see an electric light, even on the horizon, and have only the stars and the moon and the gas lights and kerosene lanterns and the candles and the, you know, and the natural sounds from the woods and the water, and it's just, you know, a treat that just regenerates people, and they can sense that when they hear about it. What? No electricity? I want to go. So we get people from all across the country that come here for that.
But if you really want to experience the true hardship of the life of a keeper, you need to travel out into the ocean, 25 miles offshore, to an isolated rock called Matinicus.
Lightkeepers provided some protection for the birds just by being there, although people were killing birds wholesale for women's hats and things. And this is one of the few places where Arctic terns breed in large numbers. It's like the major colony in Maine right now. And the birds need offshore islands where there are no predators. So the lightkeepers provided protection just by being there. And then in 1900, when things were getting really grim for the birds, the Audubon Society started paying the keepers out there to protect the birds, to keep other people from shooting them. Matinicus Rock is the only place in Maine where a natural colony of puffins has stayed through time. In other places there were puffins breeding, but they were all hunted to extinction. And now the Puffin Project under National Audubon has restored puffins to eastern Egg Rock and Seal Island, where they used to breed at one time, but you know, they were wiped out from there. So Matinicus is the only place where puffins have retained their natural colony. The puffins spend their summers, their breeding seasons on islands, on Matinicus, and they nest under the boulders. And then in the winter, they just take off and live out at sea. Actually, they spend the first 3 years of their life, 3 or 4 years of their life at sea, because they don't reach breeding age till they're 4 or 5. Sometimes they'll come back and visit and check it out, but they don't come back to stay for the summer until they're breeders. Actually, I got involved by working for the Audubon Society. Originally, we were just working with puffins on eastern Egg Rock, and we also work on Matinicus Rock, and there's a lighthouse there. So when I got shifted over to work on Matinicus Rock, I became really interested in the lighthouse and the role of light keepers in bird preservation. And part of our job there is to help maintain the light station in exchange for leasing the place. And so we've gotten really involved in remortaring the light and doing a lot of repairs. Originally, the keepers were really instrumental in saving this bird colony. Because they were here, because they could protect the birds from the hunters, they saved the colony. And so it's been people saving birds. And now that the light's automated, Audubon Society's taken over the management of it and maintenance. And we're helping to keep the light as well as to keep the birds safe.
Whether a lighthouse is being used as a bed and breakfast, a museum, or housing for the Audubon Society, lighthouses are being kept alive. They grew out of the need for a better navigation technology to protect ships coming and going from our ports. And it was that same technological advancement that outgrew lighthouses. Yet today, we sometimes have a desire to return to the simpler times. Times when families lived out their lives with a strong and independent spirit dedicated to a greater cause. Times when it meant something to grease the bearings, clean the lens, trim the wick, and send out the light.
Subconsciously, a lighthouse is that light against that dark, dangerous sea. It's the signpost. It's the last bit of civilization before the sailor takes off into the unknown waters. And until this century, 90% of all transportation was done by water, by rafts, by ships, by barges. Your loved one was coming home by water, or the fineries from Paris were being delivered by water. So water, and of course it occupies a great portion, a very great percentage of the globe, and it's very dangerous out there. So lighthouses are a beacon of homecoming, coming home from the sea. They are also, to some people, a religious connotation. It's the light against the dark. And of course, like a church steeple, they point up into the heavens. They're fascinating because they are a different type of structure. There's one purpose, there's an altruistic purpose. That's their only purpose is altruism, to protect the mariner, to show him the way to safe harbor.
People dream of what it would be like and the importance of keeping the light shining. And now everything is so automated and so high-tech, they're becoming obsolete and unnecessary. It's a part of our maritime history that's extremely important. It's a part of the romance of the lighthouse keeper that I think needs to be kept alive.
The people who manned them were often rugged individuals. They were people who didn't want a desk job. They loved the sea, they loved to be outside. They wanted their families to grow up in an atmosphere that was maybe untainted by the modern world. And many of them were very removed from the modern world, especially the ones out on the island.
The Cape Florida Lighthouse represents a cultural heritage of a mariner environment that is, bar none, the premier example. We can replace, by example, the function of the Cape Florida Lighthouse, but we truly can't replace the Cape Florida Lighthouse. It needs to be restored because it is a part of our heritage. It's a part of history, not only of Florida, but also of the United States, and how the importance that lighthouses played in the development of this country.
I've worked on numerous different historic sites. Lighthouses have more of a universal appeal than any other historic site I have ever seen. People seek lighthouses out. I think it's because of the mystery. I think it's because of the romance. I think it's because of the danger and the courageous actions of lightkeepers throughout their history. The seafaring life, the sense of independence and self-sufficiency that you associate with lightkeepers. There are a lot of factors. There's something almost spiritual about them.
Everybody has a certain interest in lighthouses, and some people are more or less hooked on them, you might say. They want to see them everywhere. But I think there is something about a lighthouse that is appealing to everyone. That it's a beautiful location, for one thing. Its utility is another. It just, there's something that we hope will never go away, that that'll always be with us.
We are intrigued by the idea of living in a place that has a lot of storms and a lot of weather changes. And a lighthouse is almost a pioneering type of situation where you must keep the light going at all times, and it can be rough and ready.
Lighthouses today are very, very important to the American people. There's a great love and a nostalgia that the American people have for the lighthouses. You can see it in literature, you can see it in music, you can see it in art. Lighthouses keep popping up, and it's neat to be able to see some of the things that people get out of lighthouses in terms of the symbolism and the imagery. There's always been a feeling of hope. A lot of corporations use the lighthouse for their corporate logos, for security, a symbol of security, trust, truth, sending out the light.